Look, thank you for those introductory words, Ian and Paul. This session, as I said, is about transformational technology, and I think we've got quite a wide array of comments about transformational technology. But just let me see if I can summarise it and say that Robert tells us it's all about video. Well, it's mostly about video. Gerd has added to that some of the elements of telepresence, meaning how much the video is different to the video you're used to with Skype, augmented reality, and some new interfaces. Is that really? Does that sort of summarise it from the panel's point of view? That's really the technology that drives this high-speed future. Or is there something we're missing?
Yeah, what we see is that near term, right? 5 years is near term, right? This is not the longer term. Paul talks about, what some other people refer to as the Internet of Things, when it's billions and billions of devices. Some of which, by the way, your milk carton doesn't need very many bits to talk to the fridge to talk to your smartphone, but in aggregate, that's going to be huge. And it does require low latency and ubiquitous computing and connectivity. And by the way, that's all going to be connected by radio, right? So it's going to be a wireless, untethered world that's going to, in aggregate, require broadband. The near term is going to be video, as far as we see. And again, it's more observational than a prediction. We're already seeing this. So, but the important point is when we talk about video, it's not necessarily traditional. It is absolutely not necessarily. It is not traditional television.
Right.
Yeah, there's the lead investor in Twitter, I think, or Facebook, was it Kleiner Perkins? They have put together a presentation on the internet trends every year. Mary Mika does this. And last year they emphasized it was 3 things: social, local, and mobile. Solo-mo, they call it, right? That has become a very good tagline. So for you guys who need a cheap Twitter feed, this is one of them. So I would add to that social, local, mobile, video. And that's summarizing where everything is going at this point. And I would also say, I think that even though this is all sort of techie stuff, this is not at all about technology, right? This is about how people change and how culture changed because of this. I mean, when the printing press was invented, the biggest deal wasn't the fact that you could print a book, but that the church had to put up with the fact that people had information. Right? I mean, that changed the world, and the church found a way actually to co-opt Gutenberg. It's a long story. But in any case, what's happening now is that the flip side of this technology stuff is that we also have to figure out how we can remain or become human in this technology, right? For example, yes, we can do all this cool stuff, but is it going to be human for me to be tracked in every movement I make and be reminded of another move I should make? I'm not so sure. So I think there's going to be a lot of discussions about the benefit of that technology, just like the benefit of the book, or radio for that matter, that we shouldn't keep track of, and ask the question whether it makes sense that we can do it, that we should do it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one thing the internet's very good at is cutting out the middlemen. If you look at all the industries that it's ravaged, newspapers, classified advertising, this is the key driver. There's a lovely piece in The Economist about the future of HBO, and it would appear that what HBO wants to do is oddly enough, sell television programs to us, to the individual customers who will be able to then pay HBO directly. At its peak, Top Gear UK was averaging 300 million downloads per episode. If everybody was paying $1, I think Jeremy Clarkson would probably be quite happy. If you were paying 50 cents each, you'd be quite happy. And I would pay that. I'd happily pay them directly. But we have no mechanism to do that. We've got a raft, that whole industry of soggy middle management that's getting in the way and is not adding value. It's a dinosaur. Its day has been and gone, and we don't need them to aggregate data anymore. We can do it for ourselves.
I mean, the thing is, of course, we have tremendous power now as consumers, and we have to use it. I mean, last year there were, I think, 56 laws were either overturned or didn't get through because of Facebook action. And Facebook is just one of those examples. I mean, we have to use this power, and of course, many of us don't really understand how this works, or we're worried about it, right? But I think if there were another 100 celebrities tweeting like Stephen Fry does about the quality of whatever, right, it would change, right? I mean, this is basically what happens when you have networked society effect, that we can actually do this, right? And we just have to use it and we have to be aware of it.
If the number one work activity on holiday is doing work, does that mean people will increasingly choose their holiday destinations by where they can do work or where they can't do work?
It's a bit of both, because there's a market out there for destinations that haven't got broadband, that have isolation, because authenticity and a real environment is a core driver. For example, we come to New Zealand for big landscapes, getting away from it, etc., etc. So there'll always be that drive. But holidays can't be defined as a length of time. Some people are here for 2 weeks, a month, or a weekend, and there's a connectivity. Because when the tourist comes to New Zealand, it's how they engage and how they use data to interpret. So if you talk about South Korean tourists, Japanese tourists, very high-tech savvy, who will use their mobile phone or their tablet to read information rather than, for example, using an eyesight or some other information gateway. So it transforms how tourists engage with information and knowledge and video on holiday and prior to booking.
So, again, a data point of one, me. Right? I use my iPhone online to find restaurants when I'm on holiday, right? I use the GPS to help me navigate and get me to where I want to go. Except when I'm in places when the data roaming charges are so high, it would cost more than the flight to get there. So, I think that so just because people are online, right, there's a huge personal benefit to each of us to use those tools to enjoy holiday better, to disconnect. I mean, it is important, Gerd pointed out, there's an off switch, right? We all need to be able to use it. But we're not going to be able to take advantage of those things if we have, pricing structures that say you will be penalized, right? It's going to cost more than your hotel room if, you're going to actually go online to get the map to figure out, how to get where you want to go. I've always found it kind of interesting and amazing that, the little tube of shampoo in your room that they give you for free actually costs more than your Wi-Fi connection costs the hotel, right? They give you that for free, and then they charge you $15 for 300 megabytes, right, for your hotel Wi-Fi. And what's interesting, at least in the US, the low-end hotels give you Wi-Fi for free, right? The high-end hotels charge you even more. Figure it out. At some point, that's going to change.
I think you've just discovered one of those, that paradox in economics known as the diamond water paradox. Water is an essential of life, but it's free, and diamonds are completely and utterly unnecessary, but are very expensive. Look, before we go on there, just on the very core question of technology, I mean, moving on from the idea of video and then the whole Internet of Things and the explosion, is there anyone in the audience who's got a perspective on the technology aspect they think either hasn't been dealt with properly or they'd like to add to or ask about? On the very specific, the technology piece, rather than how we use it. Whilst I've got your attention, also, those people out there listening to the streamed webcast, which I hope is still working. Still working? Yes,
Seems
good.
Yeah.
If they want to ask a question, feel free, and I'm sure via Twitter, I'm sure one of the people monitoring the Twitter at the back will ask it on their behalf. So you are able to participate in this conference wherever you may be. Look, I'm going to try to make a quick summary of that technology piece, and the bit that I think Robert summarised it all in his last slide. It's that the content itself is getting fatter because it's a lot of video. That video may be entertainment video, it may be conferencing video, it may be high definition video, but it's also both directional content, and it's the fact that you've got more than one thing going on at one time. So it's this sort of like fundamental thing. It's It's multiple concurrent bidirectional traffic, much of which is connected to the cloud and therefore requires low latency. Is that a really simple summary of where we're heading? Okay. Yeah. It's just when you say it like that, you sit there saying, so it's got to be fibre.
Yes. Well, fibre and radio.
Fibre and radio, yeah. Because radio,
the device, you're not going to wander around with your tablet or your smartphone with an Ethernet jack.
No. Well, someone also tweeted the fact they've got an Ethernet port, a laptop here without an Ethernet port on it. You know, it's just got a while. I have got a question up there and one over there, so I'll take those two questions before we move on.
Just coming back, Stephen Ellis from Red Hat New Zealand, coming back to what you said about the technology aspect, and one of the issues with this pervasiveness of connectivity is still we have single points of failure in the network. You're talking about fibre as a distribution environment. It's well documented that thanks to a rat, most of the internet in New Zealand went off air several years ago. You know, we've got this point where, in the area where I live recently, especially with the storms last week, there was a considerable number of power cuts. You know, we have a power network which has multiple single points of failure. Are we facing a broadband network with multiple single points of failure within it? You know, within the household, if you want this pervasive, always available connectivity, well, what happens when the power goes down? What happens when a rat gnaws through the fibre connection to your neighbourhood? What happens when a lightning strike hits the mobile mast that's feeding your home? This isn't pervasive. It isn't always available.
So how's that different from today?
Well, part of the problem is it isn't different from today.
Yeah, exactly. So we're no worse off, and I think we're actually potentially a lot better off, because when you have the new if you're designing new networks, right? So let's go through the thought exercise, right? Which is greenfield, nothing existed, you're designing from scratch. The networks we would design would be very different than what we either currently have or we're overlaying on top of the existing, in terms of self-healing, redundant, reversible rings for the communications piece, right? Electricity, by the way, is a huge issue, right? I live in suburban Washington, and I lose power more frequently than my colleague in Gurgaon, New Delhi, and he teases me about that all the time. So I talk about living in an emerging economy when it comes to electricity, even though I have multiple fibers in front of my house for communications. So there clearly are things that we need to address in terms of the reliability of essential infrastructures. And, you know, there will be, even in a 5 nines world, right? There's that point, 0001 where things do go down. What's really interesting is that there are, in some countries, more internet connections than there are places connected to electricity. Right? And people are, what's driving them to solar and renewables and other really creative electrical generation, what's driving them to that where they've never seen a need before is the need to have electricity, to have connectivity for broadband. Right? So it's kind of an interesting turning upside down of what the demand drivers can be. But you're absolutely right. We have to fix that, but it's no worse than today, but actually in some ways it could be better.
And there was one over the other side as well. Unless anyone else wanted to comment on that. It was up here. Could you put your hand up so the microphone can find you?
Bronwyn Howell, New Zealand Institute for the Study of Competition and Regulation. I'm very interested in the figures that you've put about the growth of the average consumption, but I've been monitoring the difference between the mean consumption and the median consumption of broadband connections for about the last 10 years. An interesting phenomenon that appears to have come out is that as we've got faster connections, the difference between the mean to median has got even greater. So whereas 10 years ago we were looking at a 2 to 1, we're now looking in the US to about a 4 to 5 to 1 in terms of the ratio between the median user, which is the 50%, versus the mean, which is in this highly skewed distribution, tending to suggest that the power users are getting hungrier and greedier, whereas the average user, even though the number is rising, we've still got a very fat-tailed distribution there. Can you explain whether, in a video world, which appears to be driving this, is whether that's going to get exacerbated and how you see that trading off? And also for the first speaker, how this also now pertains to the issue of equity, because is equity about people being able to access the network, or is equity about the percentage of the network resources that each individual consumer is using?
Yeah, so one of the things I didn't show, and I'm happy to share it because of time, is that in the study we released last week, what we found was that going forward, the top 20% of the users consuming the bandwidth actually is growing faster than the top 1%, right? So actually, it's beginning to catch up and equalize. Now, the real question from a social policy is not, the top 50%, it's the bottom 20%, all right? And I think that's the equity question that we have to address in terms of affordability. First of all, availability, right? So low income, the bottom 20% tend to be either very rural or urban poor. So in one case, it's a reach issue of availability because of low density, as well as potentially income. But the urban poor, it tends to be an affordability issue, and there can be targeted ways to address that. But in terms of consumption, what we've seen is that once people get connected and they start using it and they start consuming the video, actually, again, I'll share it with you later, the most recent data show that actually those gaps are beginning to close, and it's not because the top 1% are using less, it's because everybody else is using more. Right? And that's actually increasing, and that's just the nature of video. Second, one of the biggest barriers to the adoption and use of the internet, especially in emerging economies, not here in New Zealand, but in India, parts of rural Asia, parts of rural inner city Latin America, is literacy. Right? You have to be literate to use the internet. That is changing with voice recognition, voice commands, gesturing commands. And what you will begin to see, so why is it that we have about a little over 5 billion people that have mobile phones in their pockets? They create their own content, right? There's a lot of reasons, right? Today, right, you don't have that with broadband. How can what are the variables that we need to address so that we can follow the mobile miracle globally with the broadband miracle, right? So that we have 5 billion people connected to broadband, and eventually 6 billion, 7 billion. Literacy is one of those issues. Well, technology with voice recognition, voice command, actually will be addressing that. So there are a number of issues with the bottom 20% from social policy that actually are being addressed. We're not there yet, and we really can't take our eye off that. We really need to focus on it. It's really important. But I'm very optimistic, and that's why I actually liked your intervention to that one question, because I essentially don't agree with the assumption of the question to Gerd that actually things are getting worse. I think things are actually getting better.
And Paul, did you? Oh, sorry, Gerd.
Yeah. Okay. I want to comment on this because I think what we're seeing is that we are, technology-wise, we're actually moving ahead quite nicely, and we're entering this whole debate about the cloud-based content and so on. But you can basically argue that our technology is in the cloud and fast, but our minds are still fixed wire. Our behavior and our business plans are still very much like even before the internet. I mean, the fixed wire mind, right? That's our biggest problem. Is technology is moving quite nicely, but we're acting like we're still there, physically carrying CDs around or things like that, right? And this is becoming a major issue also when it's about the question of who gets to use it, right? Because we always go back to saying wherever the most money is, that's where we put most of the resources, right? And it's all very like quarter to quarter kind of driven, right? If we start thinking beyond this, right, and we basically say, okay, let's think about how would a cloud-based business model look like, right? That's when we're going to see a real driver for broadband adoption, because a cloud-based business model would solve a lot of problems of everyone, not of the illustrious 1% on top, right? Which is nice for those guys like ourselves, right? That these problems are solved. But if we want to solve 99% of the population's problem, we have to think a cloud-based idea, right? a web-native business model. In developing countries, that means a mobile-native business model. Right? I mean, Africans don't have banks; they bank with their mobile phone. Right? They want to read a book; they're very likely to read the book on their mobile device. Right? They can actually now do outsourced work through SMS. Right? They can get medical advice through SMS. Right? All these things are happening on the mobile. So I think that's the main emphasis that I would set forth as an idea to say, well, let's figure out how we can get the business models and the general things in the direction of a cloud-based, web-native model rather than just technology.
And Paul, did you have a...
Just to talk about the local situation a little bit, the rural-urban divide in New Zealand is a real critical concern for me, not only because of the rural part of New Zealand is the backbone of the economy. It is responsible for so much of our revenue stream, and yet, broadband speaking, they're in a backwater. And I think the RBI is a great first step. We'll start to see rollout of fibre deeper into the network. We'll see copper services off that. But really still we're talking about 5 megabits a second when the rest of us are looking to how we'll spend 100 megabits a second. And I think that gap needs to be addressed in the very near future, or we'll end up with quite a bit of imbalance in terms of access itself, let alone what you can do with it once you get access. Hopefully the next step for RBI will be when we release the 700 megahertz spectrum that's coming up for LTE services. If there's a component of that says if you buy the spectrum, you've got to roll out in rural areas, I think we'd be quite supportive of that. I'd like to see rural New Zealand get an opportunity to use LTE sooner rather than later.
You leant forward, Robert. Was there something you wanted to contribute?
No, I agree. I mean, I think that's a huge lever. And again, it's about making sure that everybody in a society has access to the new services. And in the rural areas, it's going to have to be radio in terms of access.
There was a tweet here earlier on this discussion whether a flat rate or free internet access would equalize society. Somebody asked the question, and I think to a great extent it may. Right, but this is a technology tool, right? So the same question that's saying, would the book printing, the Gutenberg event, would that lead to freedom, which it did lead to reformation, right? And some sort of, people call that enlightenment of some sort, right? In those days, right? I think it would, and that's why I think it's important, right, to do that. It also leads to, of course, a flatter hierarchy, and this is precisely the reason that we don't have it, right? Because we don't want those people to express their opinion. Now, I think this is a crucial point, right? Because basically what we do is we give them a tool of empowerment, and in return, we're the ones that they're taking a shot at. Right? Yeah. And so this is one of the issues. For example, I do a lot of work in Indonesia. The government wants to put every Indonesian person on the internet with high-speed mobile internet, right? But guess what? What did they do first? They never even had radio or television on some of those islands, right? The first thing they do with their mobile phone is to go on YouTube, right? And do things they're not supposed to see, right? And the government says, well, this is not good. You know, we didn't want this. You know, we want you to buy stuff on the internet. So I think, again, as I was saying earlier, if we are obsessed with control, we won't do this, right? Because there's no point, right? Because we can't keep control and have this, right? So this is why we need to say, let's look less towards control, but more towards enablement. And that's also where the new money is. We just have to realize that it's a little bit more of a possible detour in a way, you'd say.
Look, I do have a contribution from over there on the aisle, so I'll keep with contributions from the floor and rather than moving aside.
Good morning. I'm Christopher Ragg from Waiheke, and I'm just following through some of the previous speakers' comments. But my question particularly relates to using ultra-fast broadband as an economic driver, and I was wondering how that fitted into the conference, because we're talking about demand and technology, but some of us have responsibilities towards seeing how it might enable us to actually do better as a country or as a city or from an economic perspective, and you talked about the rural perspective. And within that debate, I have noticed that in the reference in the speakers of the conference, we've taken a very Anglo-Saxon approach, and we haven't had much interface from Asia, which has a very different role. And the role I'm really asking a question about is what's the role of government and local government within this debate, especially related to as an economic driver?
Well, can I re-ask that question for you in the two parts, because the first part I think was the better one, which is how does it work? How does it work as an economic driver? And then the question about government involvement is, if you like, the second part of the question. But I think it's really bringing you to that first question, and that's where I thought Ian would be good.
Thank you.
High speed broadband is an economic driver. High speed broadband is an enabler. High speed broadband is about entrepreneurship and innovation. And the example I always give is it saved the sock industry in Switzerland. If you go onto SwissSocks.net or something like that, you can log on, because wool, like New Zealand, wool in Switzerland is very expensive. It's a niche product. So what happened in Switzerland was, the Swiss sheep industry is a cottage industry, so all of the farmers got together, and what they decided was to launch a website called SwissGrannies.net. That's the one. You go online, you pick a design of socks, and then you pick a granny to knit the socks for you. So it's taken the Swiss sock industry to the rest of the world. So what I'm trying to say, it has changed the distribution patterns. And there's many examples across the world of suppliers of whatever product in a local niche market, and the internet and high-speed broadband has changed that market and that market profile to the rest of the world. So for New Zealand, if we don't have it, it becomes a barrier to economic growth. It stifles entrepreneurship and innovation.
You know, at the analytic, those are great examples, right? And there are a whole slew of them we can find that are, you know, narratives of specific industries and specific countries that essentially have been saved or created by broadband connectivity. But in terms of the macro analysis, there's some very interesting work at the World Bank, especially for emerging economies, not New Zealand. You know, for every 10% increase in broadband adoption, there's a 1.5 to 1.8% increase in GDP. In the developed economies, it's slightly less than that, but it's they've come up with this positive correlation, correlation with some causality. Most of the work, because the regression analyses are very difficult, have correlation, but there is a growing body of work that actually makes the link between broadband availability, broadband adoption, increase in productivity, and GDP growth. The UN has something called the Broadband Commission. It's a global UN Broadband Commission. And they have linked broadband adoption to, I think it's 7 out of the 8 Millennium Development Goals. So I think that it is no longer a question that the use of broadband does lead to economic gains. I think that it's clear that if you are in a competitive world and you do not have broadband, your small, medium enterprise in particular will be handicapped. The large enterprises actually choose locations where to invest and put facilities, whether back offices or factories. One of the important variables for that decision process is the availability of broadband. So I don't think that that's the question. The question I think that's more relevant is your second question, which is, if you don't have it, what can government do to make sure that you do, right? And that is, I think, really in many ways the focus of the conversation.
And you said, if I can jump in, you were from Waiheke? Yeah, well, the first thing it would probably be to organise pitchforks and torches and go around and find those silly buggers who keep saying, don't build cell phone towers here because we don't want your internet. Make sure that they stop.
Well, another angle, of course, you know, I don't know, you heard of the state of Bhutan.
Yes.
You know, they suggested a new definition of GDP, which I think we should look at, especially for New Zealand, and they call it the gross national happiness factor.
Yes.
Okay, and they're suggesting for that to take over the GDP, because the problem with that is that if it's always about the financial growth, it doesn't consider lots and lots of other factors, right? And I think this would be a good thing for New Zealand to look at, you know, what is beyond the growth in terms of money, right? Because there are many issues that are important besides the growth of money and revenues, but maybe a combination of the two would be an interesting angle, you know, GDP and growth national happiness factor.
I won't go there. I've got a queue. I've got one there, then a lady here, and then Renee. Gentlemen?
Yeah, hi. A question for Dr. Pepper, David McGrath from Cisco. Here in New Zealand, the service providers haven't launched IPTV services because Sky Television has monopoly ownership of the content, particularly the rugby and sports, and they've struggled to make the economics work. When you did your analysis and it showed New Zealand's usage lagging even against Australia in the last few years and going forward over the next few years, did you adjust your model because of that as a key factor? And if so, do you think the government needs to address that monopoly ownership?
I'm not going near that one. Thanks a lot. The model specific, does not take into account specific domestic, legacy contractual arrangements such as, premium sport contracts. It looks at the historic growth over the last 5 years and then forecasts out on a variety of variables. I do think that as a general matter, what's very interesting is what's happening in, for example, the U.S. with premium sport, right? So you have the major sport leagues there of the National Basketball Association, the NBA, the National Football League, Major League Baseball. Those rights traditionally have been tied up with long-term contracts with traditional broadcasters and cable operators. So it's similar to the Sky situation here. What's been happening over the last 12 to 18 months is that the rights holders, right, the sports leagues, have begun to offer content directly over the internet in addition to through the traditional distribution means. So what's happening now is that it's the intermediaries, because they've actually they've created huge value for the leagues through their distribution contracts. So they've been exclusives. The leagues themselves have begun to realize that that's not the way for the leagues to actually maximize the benefits and revenues to the leagues, right? What they're beginning to see is that it's not either or, it's both. And so some of that content is now beginning to be made available. And some actually very interesting, examples of in addition to. So you might be watching the game on your subscription from cable, but over the broadband, I'm paying additional, right, a fee directly to the league so that I can get replays, I can get different camera angles, and I can get the statistics on all of the players, right? And it's all in real time. So there's some interesting models that are evolving, and this goes to the question of, is it better for me as the rights holder to try to control everything or actually to open it up so that more people can see my content in more places at more times on more devices? So it's a transition. Eventually, we're going to be getting there.
It's actually, that's an interesting example. I mean, we've actually just had two examples of changing business models that we don't necessarily always think about. The SOC model was a changing business model. The broadcasting rights is another changing business model. The broadcasters are suddenly discovering they're not actually content makers. They've only ever been intermediaries. The sports people make the content. They're the ones who put on the game. HBO makes the TV program. It has also been a distributor. But it's a really interesting example of how, when you start thinking about what the business model changes are, how significant and how far through the value network, or what did you call it, Gerd? A value, one of you changed it from value chain.
Value circle. Value circle.
How big the changes are in the value circle. Sorry, I just wanted to sort of link those two together because I thought they were interesting examples.
I mean, clearly there's a challenge to the market economy here, right? Because in my view, I think that a position that says you don't do these new things because the old things will continue to pay you more, but only serve less of the population, and then you turn around and tell the rest of the population they can't do any of the other stuff, that becomes a situation that you could say is extortion in a way, right? Yeah. And you can call it whatever you want, but in the end, basically, we have reached a point, because it's moving very quickly, that it's a criminalization, especially of young people on the web, that everything that's cool is forbidden. Right? And so a lot of things there are a little bit out of whack. Right? And we need to look at the larger story. I think government needs to step up at that point and say, well, you have to do something to make this work for everyone. And this is a much larger story, I think, also in the end about exclusive rights and so on and so on and so on. I mean, anybody that's in the licensing business knows these terms from everyday language, right? That needs to change to actually get with the internet frame of mind and become web native, right?
So part of this also, David, is what Clay Christensen, the Harvard Business School professor, has written about in terms of the innovator's dilemma. At what point do you stop protecting legacy and start going with the new thing, right? And it's natural. It's not good or evil. It's not about bad intentions. It's just sort of natural. And it's really difficult for incumbents to recognize when they are at that tipping point and that they just sort of have to flip. So, for example, in the U.S., Verizon actually invented, it was Bell Atlantic at the time, they actually had a lot of the patents in ADSL. They developed it for the distribution of video back in the early 1980s. And for a variety of reasons, it didn't quite work for them initially, and then they held it off the market. The telcos did not deploy DSL because they did not want to compete with their T1 business, right? Their 1.5 megabit symmetric, right?
Absolutely.
Classic copper network, right? So they held off deploying DSL. The cable industry, actually in the US, because of the development of cable modems, actually said, wait a second, we can provide data. So they started rolling out cable modem service in broadband. And all of a sudden, Bell Atlantic, right, began to see that they were they're facing a competitor. And there was a point at which they actually had to make a flipping decision to actually just flip over and start deploying to compete both on the defensive side as well as offensive, right? And they made that decision. Today, when you take a look at Verizon's latest earnings report, their business is growing. What's growing? Mobile, fiber to the home. What is declining? Copper telephony. Their future is in broadband. They've rolled out the first nationwide LTE network. Their future is in wireless broadband, fiber, and fixed broadband, right? And they actually made that decision and recognized it ahead of the curve. And that is one of the most difficult things that you can do when you're running a legacy business, when you're trying to protect and harvest legacy revenues. It's natural. It's not, again, as I said, bad people, right? It's just the natural thing to do. The question is, when can you get ahead of that in terms of your thinking so that you can ride the wave, right, as opposed to try to push back and prevent it from overtaking you?
Can I make a quick point on this? Many of my clients are on this exact place, right? And I almost observe there's only two ways that they change, just like people change. One is pain, and the other one is love, right? If we rule out love as an issue for large companies, right, they need to feel pain, otherwise they don't change.
Yeah, right? I think of this as fear or greed.
Right. It's very much the same variant, right? So if we stop buying what they have to offer, right, they will feel the pain, they will change. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think for all startups and companies who are in this new business, it's about disruption, right? You have to disrupt something, otherwise you don't exist. I mean, nobody's going to pay any attention if we don't disrupt Twitter, right? Who are they disrupting? CNN, right? I mean, it's TNN now. Right? I mean, who has YouTube killed? Basically MTV, right? And Google has not killed Microsoft, but put a nice dent into it, and so on and so on. If we don't disrupt, then don't even start a business, right? This is what it comes down to now, right? So pain and disruption. Very positive outlook, yeah. But, sorry.
Or pain and love. I like that better.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
Okay, now I had a question down here. Microphone lady, person. I've got a question here. Hold hand in air till microphone is placed in it.
Rosalie Nelson from Chorus. It actually goes to the heart of this discussion around the business case and the changing ecosystem. And we've talked about fear and greed being the motivators for this change. But as I'm looking forward, and we're talking, Gerd, when you were speaking, you talked of creating an environment where people made more micropayments away from the sort of free internet. There might be a form of licensing that came into it, and there would be advertising. But this is implicitly changing a number of vertically integrated industries that have a great deal of sunk investment And when I'm sort of looking at this, there would be many mouths to feed from this new type of business model, you know, the artists and as well as the content producers, as well as the telcos. Who can possibly, who do you see as being sort of the winners and the losers within this? Because it would suggest that some of the industries that we have today are not going to make that through. And it's also suggesting a lower margin model for many of the providers out there. So I'd just like to get a sense of how you can see that actually taking place.
Yeah, very good question. Just a brief answer. One thing that's really important, I think, is that you have to have somebody in a new ecosystem that becomes what I call the lubricator, you know, basically makes it work, right? So, for example, many big telcos and mobile operators, you know, for them to spend $50 million on a deal for free music or so is not a big issue, right? So in China, for example, you already have Google made a deal with the major record labels that if you use top100.cn, which Google owns, right, you type in Santana MP3, right, you will find it and you can download it legally because Google gives the record labels a piece of the search engine advertising result, right? That's already in place. How come we don't have that here, right? Well, it's very complicated why we don't have that here. But the model works. Basically, I think the really important part is to find somebody who will say, you know what, this is going to be worth a fight. I want to lubricate and put money in, right? And Facebook, with $100 billion in the bank, right, is going to lubricate a lot of serious stuff, right? And the next one is Twitter, right? When they go public, I mean, you can bet what they're going to do to the content business, right? And YouTube and all the other pieces, right? So that's what is the nature of the disruption. I mean, Richard Branson basically does that with all of his businesses, right? He finds something that doesn't really work, he puts money in, makes it work better, right? And then takes money out again. Just kidding. He does a very good job, actually. But so this is the whole idea. I mean, somebody has to step up. I mean, Richard Branson stepped up and said, you know what? All our airplanes should fly with biofuel, right? And he's investing in this. Serious money. And so you can say it's crazy, but basically if you don't take a step beyond the obvious, you'll never get there. This is why most of the incumbents don't do it, right? Because they are not going to do it because putting your head in the sling is just not what they do. Right? And if you look at Google, eBay, Amazon, I mean, when Jeff Bezos invented the Kindle, nobody asked for an electronic reader. You know, nobody knew what that was. And now he sells more books on the Kindle than he sells in print. Right? We have to make a market, right? So basically, if you're in a company that doesn't make a market, then there won't be a market for you. That's pretty much what it comes down to. And so for many of the incumbents, this is a significant problem because they've never made a market in their life. They just bought it.
Well, right. I mean, we tend to focus when we talk about business models on these really big people. And we sort of forget sometimes that business models change all the time. I mean, the car industry business model, you know, one of the classic cases in vertical integration in economics texts is the Fisher Body case and GM acquiring a body shop. And yet if you actually now look at the automotive industry, it's actually one of the most interesting ones of the very diverse manufacturing base where a bit comes from all over the place and they use the Japanese just-in-time process to bring it all together. So there's a classic case of a changing business model in an industry. It does happen all the time. But I mean, once again, coming back to Ian, I mean, we've talked there about some big players. How about little players? How is their business model being affected by all this?
Well, it's just what I previously said. The distribution change has completely changed. It's you to the rest of the world in the terms of your product. We live in a world of niche. You know, Chris Anderson's The Long Tail. We've got that opportunity now. So if you're selling paper clips or specialist glasses, you've got the opportunity to be a high-value business, very niche, with specific types of customers. Give you a classical example in tourism. It's talk about wool and sheep. But, what was the example I'm going to do? There's a trend in society of singletons. There are lots of single females and single males in society because we've postponed marriage, etc., etc. One of the growth and insurgence we've seen across the world is the dance clubs. And another type of holiday that people are doing is knitting clubs. Knitting's on the renaissance again. You'll see it in most urban centres, but people getting together to knit. And there's the world's largest provider of knitting clubs is called Stitch and Bitch. come together and talk and knit. But taking that one step further, Royal Caribbean does knitting cruises. You can get knitting books, but it's a world of niche. You can come to New Zealand and Merino Wool will work with Royal Caribbean to do that type of specialist holiday. So the distribution chain changes, and it's all about entrepreneurship and innovation. So things move on and things develop. So if you've got a very bespoke market, you're not selling this in a local market anymore. Locals changed to the rest of the world.
One comment on the many-to-many world, right? I mean, I agree with you on this, but I think in general, we will have large companies, we will have large players, we will have large corporations, we'll have large content companies, large broadcasters, but there's a significant difference, right? In this world, Facebook essentially is on the way of becoming the BBC, if you want, for that matter, or any other large broadcaster. When you think about it this way, however, we do have the power to unplug them immediately. Right? Imagine a year and a half ago, Facebook changed the terms of use, right? And they put in some provision that says whatever I write in there, they own it, or whatever, right? So within 13 hours, they had over 24 million people, 2.5 million pulled, went out, and the rest said they would, right? So 13 hours later, they said, never mind, guys, we're going back to what we had before, right? So unlike Microsoft or unlike Universal Studios or Disney or whatever, right, we do have the power to unplug them, right? This is a significant difference, right, that we're going to see in the future, that they actually have to be very transparent, very much deliver, and we have a lot of power as in an aggregate. I mean, 5 billion people connected, we can pull the plug of if we wanted to in many ways. I think that is a big difference there.
And I think I've got, oh, sorry, Paul?
Yeah, and on that point, the next big area, I mean, it's quite interesting drawing all these threads together in a business sense, but there's also the political world. And we've seen that through the Arab Spring with the use of social media to get involved. It goes beyond that, and I'm wondering if we're talking about soggy middlemen and getting rid of these value-add resellers who don't actually add value. What if we apply that same model to governments and to representation? And I know the revenue take is going to be a big issue as we move to online e-commerce in a broader sense rather than just books and electronics. Are they going to be able to charge me GST on my stuff that I bring in from the States? Well, no, probably not. So how are governments going to survive through all of this, and what changes are we going to wreak on them? It's going to be very
maybe
interesting.
In terms of internet policy, we should have a Kiwi Spring, and go look at some of these issues that are currently on the table and being discussed here. I mean, we have the same issue in Switzerland, so you're not alone there. And we do knitting as well.
And now I do have one last question from Renee down the front here, if I can get a microphone to Renee.
Thank you. This is a question to the whole audience. My name is René Sam. I'm from Ericsson. We have heard different speakers talk about the interdependency between content and broadband. And also we spoke about the importance of broadband for economy and for productivity and all the digital services. And we also recognize that there is a role for government in terms of stimulating broadband and via ICT policy. However, I haven't heard anyone saying, well, if content is important for broadband uptake, which is important for economy, why don't we think about copyright legislation in terms of having a bigger role to play than rather protecting the interest of the rights holder who invest in content? I can give you an example. For example, Ericsson spends about $5 billion on R&D investments, and if we put those into software and ICT technology, then we have all the rules that comes with ICT regulation. But if we put the same engineers trying to make a cartoon, then we are in completely different situation when it comes to protect that intellectual property, because it's a different subset called copyright, and then there are no greater demands on those investments in terms of contributing to the higher good of the society or its role into the contribution. Any thoughts about the role of copyright being part of an ICT policy and contributing to actually technology dissemination and uptake of broadband services?
Oh, I think it's vital that we get copyright and the broader issue of intellectual property right. And right now, we've got a patent bill sitting before the House at the moment, which says we can't have, outlaws software patents in New Zealand. We've got a copyright bill that's just been passed, which was poorly thought out and criminalises people for watching television. It's an area that is not going to go away anytime soon, and I think there are enough angry people out there saying, hang on, all I want to do is get my hands on content that you're denying me. I think you called it, it's a major issue for people that they can't get hold of this content any other way. And all too often I find people asking me, how do I use BitTorrent, or how do I set up a secure VPN so I can actually buy the content that I want to buy legally, because it's not available here. It's not just content, of course, it goes beyond that into a lot of online shops that will not sell you product because you're in New Zealand. You go all the way through the process, you've selected the colour and the size, and you get down finally to the small print which says, no, we won't ship to New Zealand. You know, it's the World Wide Web. It's about time we realise that this is one global market and that we need to have a set of rules that apply right across the board. And on Wednesday, Kim.com is in court fighting on very much this case, that the environment that he set up is somehow costing the industry $500 million a year, when last year was one of the biggest years for Hollywood and the music industry there has been. The losses don't stack up, and I'm pretty sure the numbers will start to come crashing down around their ears very shortly.
I mean, you see to a very large degree the efforts, for example, in the US, like SOPA and ACTA, and what we have in France, they're not driven by the people, the consumers, and they're not driven by the artists or the creators, right? They're driven by the intermediaries. It's exactly the same issue as going back again to energy or climate control. They're not driven by people who want to drive a car, but the ones selling the oil. So I think the issue really needs to be one is that the connection between the consumer and the creator has to be much more direct, right? And then we have more laws and more legislation that makes sense, because for the creator, it's the most important thing about the web is that you can have an audience, right? And then you can monetize the audience. Right? And copyright law wasn't designed, obviously, to ensure maximum protection of the middleman. It simply wasn't. So there's a few things this is up for discussion pretty much everywhere. Quite clearly, there is no such thing as copy or perform or listen, because every time I listen, I make a copy on the web. Right? So that needs to be brought forward into entirely new thinking of how that works. And again, as I was saying earlier, if we stop buying, they will give us what we want.
Does anyone else have anything to add to that, or are we going to finish on the challenging revolutionary word that we're all going to stop buying anything from Hollywood until they come?
I'm not saying that, actually.
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting question, that last one, which is, how far should the reach of an ICT policy go when you're dealing with changing business models across an entire economy? And copyright is one of those. Is it a piece of policy that belongs over there in my country in the Attorney General's Department, or is it part of ICT policy, and is that where it should go? And I better stop talking, otherwise I'll go out of bounds of what I'm allowed to say. Look, I think that's been a fascinating panel, but I'm not the only person. Someone actually tweeted it's the best panel ever. Easily best panel at an NZ telco conference, so I think you can feel justifiably proud of your achievements. I think just as a start, this is a start of a conversation. I think there's two interesting parts from the presentations themselves that I wanted to go back and remember. Gerd's opening, which is if Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. And the point that Robert raised, which is to think back, it's one I ask people to do, to think back to the days when you had a 56 kilobit per second dial-up internet service, and how many people you could find who would say, I don't need anything more than a 56 kilobit per second dial-up service, and how many of those people who've since tried a broadband service would ever go back. And equally, how many of them said that they would not use the internet more as a consequence of such a service, and yet they do. I think the panel has made it clear that the future is not uncertain at all. We know the future is a future with a lot more broadband, a lot more video-enabled, concurrent bidirectional applications. What we have opened up is a whole lot of questions about how do you get to that future faster, and that's what the rest of the conference will hopefully help us work out. So could you please join me in thanking this excellent panel?